Let's begin here, because too many mistake quiet for emptiness. A woman may stop dating, stop pleasing, stop chasing the eyes of others, and the world calls it loneliness. But it is not. It is the beginning of something sacred, not absence, but presence, not lack, but return. When the body goes still, it is not collapsing, it is listening. And what it hears is no longer the noise of validation, but the whisper of something older. Not from the world, but from within. Because when the surface calms, the depths awaken. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now consider this. We live in a time where constant movement is mistaken for progress and constant connection is mistaken for intimacy. Where desire is sold as power and detachment is misunderstood as failure. But sometimes, especially for a woman, the greatest transformation begins the moment she stops being available to everything, to everyone. The phone stays quiet. The bed stays empty. The mirror becomes unfamiliar. And the world starts to wonder what happened to her. Carl Jung believed that what we ignore in the soul returns through the body. But what we embrace in solitude returns as strength. He spoke of a journey called individuation, the slow unfolding of the self, when a woman sheds the masks she wore to belong and starts to remember who she was before the noise. Abstinence, in this light, is not a punishment. It is a portal. Not just sexual abstinence, but emotional withdrawal, spiritual retreat, energetic stillness. She begins to pull her energy back from places it was scattered, from empty conversations, shallow touches, borrowed identities. And as she does, something subtle begins to bloom. Her senses sharpen. Dreams become clearer. The air feels different. Time stretches. And in that pause, she starts to notice the space inside her, the one that had always been crowded by others' wants and her own forgotten needs. Jung might say, the persona, the mask we wear to survive, begins to crack. And behind it waits the shadow, not a monster, not shame, but the parts of her she left behind to be lovable, the parts that are now ready to return. This is where the real story begins. Not with a romance, not with a loss, but with a woman who no longer plays the game of being chosen because she has chosen herself. Her silence is not void, it is preparation. And what rises from that silence is not weakness, but a voice soft, steady, and unmistakably hers. So, if you've felt a shift in your own life lately, if your body has grown quiet, your heart less restless, don't fear it. You are not broken. You are becoming. The soul does not shout to be heard. It waits until we are finally still enough to listen. And once that listening begins, there is no going back. Because a woman who has heard the voice of her own soul no longer needs the world to tell her who she is. When a woman chooses to step away from the noise, the silence does not greet her kindly. At first, it does not feel like freedom. It feels like being forgotten. The invitations fade. The messages slow. The mirror becomes quiet. And in the spaces once filled by constant activity, a kind of ache begins to grow. Not because she misses anyone in particular, but because the rhythm that once shaped her days no longer fits the woman she is becoming. And yet she hasn't fully become her yet. She is between selves. This is the first fracture, the space between who she was and who she is meant to be. It is here that many turn back, not because they are weak, but because this stage is lonely in ways language can't quite express. To the outside world, it looks like she's just being quiet, taking a break. But inside, the break feels more like a breaking of patterns, of roles, of everything she was taught would bring her belonging. Because when a woman stops playing by the rules of validation, she no longer fits anywhere. She is no longer the muse, no longer the accommodating partner, no longer the one who bends, adjusts, and smiles through exhaustion. She is just herself, and for a time that feels like nothing. Jung once said that everything we deny in ourselves becomes fate, but everything we face becomes freedom. This fracture is where that truth begins to reveal itself, because in this moment of absence from affection, from distraction, from being needed, the real test begins. Her old self still pulls at her sleeves, not because it was true, but because it was familiar. The part of her that knew how to perform, how to stay busy, how to feel, seen through others' eyes, it doesn't disappear overnight. It lingers. It whispers. It asks, what if you're wrong? What if they forget you? What if you stay alone forever? And this is not weakness. It is the echo of a persona, the mask starting to loosen. The woman she once had to be in order to survive is afraid. Afraid of being dismissed. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid that silence means she has failed. Because silence at first feels like rejection. Rejection from a world that taught her her value was tied to visibility, to desirability, to being wanted. And suddenly, she is none of those things. Not because she has lost them, but because she has stopped offering them up on demand. And that is where the fracture deepens. Because when she no longer moves in the way others expect, the world shifts around her. Friends grow confused. Some distance themselves. They suggest she get back out there, open up, make the most of her time. They mean well, but their advice comes from the surface. They do not see that she has already begun the descent inward. They do not know how to hold space for someone walking into the dark by choice. Even family becomes uneasy. They ask if she's depressed. They worry she's isolating herself. And to them, yes, it looks that way. But she is not isolating. She is immersing. There is a difference. Jung warned that when the ego begins to lose control, it panics. And here, in this fracture, the ego clings tightly to identity, to roles, to time, to youth, to every false certainty it ever built its life around. Because the world has told women, loudly, persistently, that their worth has a deadline, that their beauty has an expiration date, that their time must be used to secure a place by someone's side. And when she chooses to pause instead, the silence feels sharp, not just outside her, but within her. It cuts through the layers of stories she absorbed over a lifetime, and for the first time, she sees how much of her movement was driven by fear. Fear of missing out, fear of being alone, fear of not being chosen, fear of becoming invisible. And now here she is not moving. And yes, the fear arrives. It creeps in during quiet nights. It speaks up when no one texts back. It tightens in her chest when she sees others moving forward on paths she no longer wants, but still mourns. This is not regression. This is grief. The grief of shedding an identity, of leaving behind what once worked, of realizing that even what was painful gave her a sense of belonging, and now that too is gone. She begins to question herself. Have I made a mistake? Am I wasting time? What if I'm wrong to step away? This is the moment where silence can feel like cruelty, but it isn't. It's the labor of the soul preparing something deeper. And before creation, there is always loss. Loss of certainty, loss of direction, loss of being understood. It is natural, even necessary, that she feels unstable. The ground beneath her is no longer familiar. She is walking not by vision, but by instinct. And instinct is quiet. Instinct does not yell. It waits. It trusts. This is why so many return to old patterns, not because they don't want to grow, but because the old roles, even when painful, offered a script, a place, a response, and now she is off script. No one tells you that healing comes with homesickness, not for a place, but for a version of yourself who once knew what to do, even if it wasn't real, even if it wasn't free. Jung described this discomfort as the beginning of the encounter with the shadow, the buried aspects of ourselves we pushed away in order to belong. And now, with no one to perform for those parts, begin to surface. At first, they do not feel like power. They feel like confusion, like longing, like restlessness without a name. But they are not signs of error. They are signs of transition. Because just like the cocoon must tighten before the butterfly emerges, the woman must feel the pressure before she transforms. This fracture is sacred, even when it feels unbearable, because it is not breaking, it is opening. And through that opening, something new will come. Not quickly, not clearly, but faithfully. She is not disappearing. She is descending into herself. And yes, the world will not understand, but she does not need it to. She only needs to stay, with the silence, with the ache, with the knowing that even if she cannot explain it, something true is beginning to form. She is not missing out on life. She is making space for the life that finally fits. And that takes time. And that takes strength. But above all, it takes staying through the fracture long enough to realize it was never about being visible to others. It was about becoming visible to herself. There comes a moment in every deep inner journey when silence no longer feels neutral. It begins to reveal. Slowly at first, and then all at once the truth beneath the surface begins to stir. And it is not always beautiful. The woman who once felt invisible now finds herself face to face with everything she tried not to see. Not in the world, but in herself. And it is here, in this unfamiliar space, where the mask starts to slip. The smile that once came automatically begins to feel false. The words she used to say without thinking now sound hollow. The habits that once made her feel wanted now feel like chains. This is not a breakdown. This is a reckoning. Carl Jung called this the encounter with the shadow. The hidden, unacknowledged parts of the psyche that we push away in order to be accepted. For most of our lives, the persona, the mask we wear, shields us from rejection. It helps us play the role the world rewards. But over time, it becomes heavy. It begins to crack under the weight of its own performance. And when the mask falls, the shadow rises. At first, it feels like discomfort. Then it feels like shame. Then confusion. You may wonder why you feel things more intensely, why you're suddenly haunted by past choices, why old regrets surface without warning. The shadow does not appear gently. It appears as longing restlessness and raw emotion. Not to punish you, but to ask for your attention. What we suppress never disappears. It waits. And now, in this space of withdrawal, it finally has room to emerge. For a woman who has stopped chasing love, stopped offering herself up for validation, the shadow is often tied to the parts of her that were silenced to stay desirable. The voice she didn't use, the anger she repressed, the instincts she ignored, the hunger she numbed. All of them begin to speak at once, not in words, but in sensations. Dreams grow strange. Moods swing without cause. Tears arrive without reason. This is not regression. It is revelation. Because what's rising is the truth of who she was before the world told her what she had to be. And this truth, this shadow is not darkness. It is depth. It is her power waiting to be reclaimed. But before it becomes power, it arrives as chaos. She questions herself more than ever, wonders if she's losing her mind, worries that she's becoming too sensitive, too distant, too difficult to understand. She doesn't know what she wants anymore, only that she can no longer pretend. And this is where the turning point quietly begins. She stops blaming others, not because they were innocent, but because her focus has shifted inward. She starts asking better questions. Not, why did they hurt me? But why did I stay so long? Not, what's wrong with them? But what part of me believed that was love? This is the language of individuation, the slow, honest unveiling of the true self. It is not easy. It strips away illusions layer by layer. It asks for integrity even in solitude. It demands that she sit with what was hidden, not to fix it, but to feel it. Because only by feeling it can she begin to integrate it. Jung taught that healing isn't about eliminating the shadow. It's about becoming aware of it, bringing it into the light of consciousness. When a woman sees her shadow clearly, she stops projecting it onto others. She no longer expects someone else to fill her emptiness or carry her pain. She no longer needs a relationship to distract her from herself. And this is where something remarkable happens. She begins to reclaim her energy. The emotional energy once spent performing pleasing, adapting now turns inward. It becomes fuel for clarity, for self-trust, for boundaries that do not bend. She sees the patterns clearly now, the cycles she repeated in love, the ways she gave too much, the times she mistook being chosen for being valued. And with that clarity comes sorrow. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. A quiet mourning for the years lost to playing small. A grief for the parts of herself she abandoned to keep the peace. A sadness for the version of her that thought self-sacrifice was the highest form of love. But grief is not the enemy. Grief is the doorway. It clears space for something new. Because once she sees the shadow, she can no longer go back to pretending. She can no longer smile through pain or say yes when her soul says no. She becomes less agreeable, less predictable, less easily swayed. And to some, that makes her difficult, but in truth, it makes her real. The woman who has met her shadow is no longer ruled by the need to be liked. She is ruled by the need to be whole. And this changes everything. It changes how she speaks. Her voice slows down, carries more weight. It changes how she listens. She no longer absorbs others' pain as her own. It changes how she loves. She gives from abundance, not obligation. But make no mistake, this stage is not glamorous. It is raw. It is quiet. It is filled with doubt, because no one applauds you for withdrawing. No one celebrates your silence. And often, no one understands the invisible labor of becoming whole. You may feel distant from people you once loved, detached from things you once enjoyed, confused by how empty the old pleasures now feel. But this detachment is not numbness. It is discernment. Your nervous system is learning what peace feels like, and peace especially for a woman who spent her life proving her worth can feel uncomfortable at first. But it is necessary, because until she meets her shadow, she cannot choose freely. She can only react, repeat, return to what is familiar, even if it hurts. Now she is choosing to pause, to reflect, to feel it all. She may not know what comes next, but she knows she can no longer pretend. And that is the beginning of freedom. Jung said that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that is exactly what this woman is doing. She is no longer afraid of the silence. She is learning to hear what lives beneath it. And slowly, steadily, she is beginning to see herself not as broken, but as unfolding. The shadow was never her enemy. It was her invitation to stop seeking completion in others, to stop performing a version of herself that felt safe, to stop confusing survival with identity. The mask is gone now, and what remains is not weakness, but truth. This is the woman the world doesn't always understand, but it is the woman who can finally begin to understand herself. When a woman has spent long enough in silence, something begins to change. At first, it's so quiet that she almost doesn't notice. It doesn't announce itself. There's no grand sign, no rush of confidence, no sudden clarity. But one morning, she finds she no longer wakes up with the same ache. The silence that once unsettled her now feels spacious, still unfamiliar, but no longer threatening. This is not a return to the woman she was. It's the beginning of something she's never been before. Carl Jung spoke of this as the first glimpse of individuation, not the final stage, but the first light breaking through the dense fog of adaptation. The moment when a person recognizes that what they've been calling emptiness is in truth unclaimed space. The space not yet occupied by anyone else's expectations. The space she once filled with noise validation or chasing love, and now it is hers. Here the withdrawal no longer feels like loss. It becomes a sacred pause, a room she didn't know she needed, a waiting place not for someone else, but for herself. This is the awakening. It often arrives in subtle forms, in the way she begins to enjoy her own rhythm, in the quiet confidence of making tea alone, in the softness of evenings without needing company. What once felt like loneliness begins to reveal its true face presence. Stillness becomes a companion. Her thoughts no longer shout. Her body no longer pleads. The hunger that once cried out for touch, attention, or approval begins to fade, not because she has grown cold, but because she is no longer starving. Something deeper has begun to feed her. This is what Jung meant when he said the soul begins to speak only after the body grows still. Because when the outer rituals fall away, the inner ones finally have space to take root. She starts to notice her dreams more. They feel vivid, symbolic, alive. Small intuitions arise in her day-to-day life, unexplained but true. Patterns she once couldn't see now become clear. She recognizes what drains her, what enlivens her, and what no longer fits. And more importantly, she begins to believe herself, no longer needing others to confirm what she feels, no longer shrinking her intuition in exchange for approval, no longer explaining her silence or softening her edges to make others comfortable. She is beginning to trust her own knowing. This shift is not loud. In fact, it is barely visible to others. But within her, it feels like a homecoming, like remembering something ancient she had long forgotten. Jung called this the awakening of the feminine unconscious, the realm of symbols, instincts, dreams, and inner wisdom that modern life so often buries. For women especially, this is not just psychological. It is deeply embodied. She feels herself more grounded in her skin. She moves slower, chooses with intention, speaks less, but says more. There is a stillness in her that no longer feels empty, but full. Full of something unnamed, but undeniable. The rituals of silence become her temple. The morning without a phone. The long walk without explanation. The journal filled with thoughts she never shared. The bath drawn without purpose. These are not acts of indulgence. They are preparation. They are the soft groundwork of rebirth. And it is here that abstinence no longer feels like sacrifice. It feels like sovereignty, because she no longer fears being untouched. She sees now that her body is not waiting. It is listening, not deprived, but discerning. Not on pause, but in sacred observation of what is truly worthy to enter again. What once felt like need now feels like choice. She doesn't need someone beside her to feel alive. She doesn't need compliments to feel seen. She doesn't need a lover to feel desired. She sees herself now, and that is enough. And in this seeing, she begins to redefine love altogether. Not as urgency, not as possession, not as performance, but as resonance, as recognition, as something that can only arise when two whole beings choose one another not to complete, but to accompany. Jung believed that most suffering comes from living out of alignment with the self. And now, slowly, gently, this woman is beginning to align. She is not fully there. The journey continues. But she has crossed a threshold. Her worth is no longer dependent on anyone's gaze. Her identity is no longer shaped by anyone's role. Her value is no longer measured by what she gives away. And in this clarity, she becomes dangerous, not because she harms, but because she no longer conforms. And the world conditioned to reward performance doesn't quite know what to do with a woman who no longer plays along. Her silence now unsettles those who once relied on her compliance. Her absence now reveals the space she once filled without question. Her presence, even without effort, now holds weight. She has become still, but not invisible. Still, but not silent. Still, but fully undeniably here. This is the sacred paradox of awakening. She is more alone than ever, yet she feels more connected. She speaks less, but says more. She gives less away, but feels more whole. She desires less, but feels more alive. And the energy that once scattered itself across relationships, achievements, and performances, it returns home. It fuels her clarity. It strengthens her spine. It softens her heart. And it gives her a kind of magnetism that no amount of effort could manufacture. She no longer seeks to be chosen. She is chosen by herself, chosen by her soul, chosen by the life that now unfolds without needing to chase it. And yet, this is not the end. It is not perfection. It is not a final state. It is simply the turning, the moment when abstinence becomes presence, when silence becomes language, when solitude becomes power. What others once called her emptiness is now her altar. What they mistook for passivity is now discernment. What they labeled loneliness is now sacred attention. Because when she stopped asking the world to give her meaning, meaning found her. Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This is what that looks like, not a lightning bolt, not a moment of glory, but a slow, rooted awakening that redefines what strength truly is. Not domination, not control, but presence. A presence that no longer performs. A presence that does not explain itself. A presence that does not chase, but draws in what aligns. And so she continues, still walking quietly, still feeling deeply, still listening within. But now she walks not as someone searching, but as someone remembering. She does not need to arrive anywhere. She already is. The woman who once feared her silence now reveres it. The woman who once doubted her worth now honors it. The woman who once longed to be chosen has chosen herself. And from this sacred ground, she will begin to choose again. But this time, with eyes open, heart steady, and a soul that speaks clearly beneath it all. Something changes when a woman stops waiting, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. She no longer waits for the message, the gesture, the proof. She no longer sits in quiet hope that someone else will name her worth. She no longer softens herself to keep someone close, not because she has closed her heart, but because she has finally opened her eyes. This is the moment of decision. And though it may look quiet from the outside, it is the loudest moment of all. Carl Jung wrote that individuation is not just about self-awareness, it is about action, a turning point where a person begins to live in alignment with what they've discovered within. And that alignment always requires a choice, often a hard one. For the woman who has met her shadow and heard her soul, that choice is this: to live by truth, even when it costs her comfort. She no longer entertains what drains her. She no longer says yes from guilt. She no longer accepts connection just because it's offered. Her time, her attention, her energy, all of it becomes sacred again, not guarded out of fear, but held with intention. She is no longer afraid to disappoint those who only knew the version of her that overgave. This is where the boundaries begin, not as walls, but as definitions, not as punishment, but as clarity. She no longer explains her standards. She embodies them. And as she does, something remarkable happens. The world begins to adjust. The people who once relied on her compliance may fall away. The dynamics that fed on her doubt may fade. Some connections dissolve quietly. Others end abruptly. This, too, is part of the fire, because everything that was built on her forgetting herself cannot survive her remembering. And while this may seem like loss, it is actually purification, a necessary burning down of what was never rooted in truth. Jung spoke of transformation as a kind of death, not of the self, but of the false self, the persona, the mask, the identity shaped by others' desires. That part must die for the soul to breathe freely. And so it does. She no longer tries to be chosen. She chooses, with calm, with discernment, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows that what's meant for her will not require her to abandon herself. The invitations come, the old patterns knock, the familiar voices tempt. But now she pauses, she listens, and she responds not from habit, but from awareness. There's no longer a need to prove her worth through acceptance. She doesn't chase closure or perform needlessness. She simply allows what is misaligned to pass by without clinging. Because her energy is no longer spread thin. It gathers now. It concentrates. It becomes heat. And that heat, that fire, is not rage. It is her own life force returning. The desire she once poured outward now turns inward, not selfishly, but sacredly. She tends to herself with the same care she once gave away too easily. Her body, once treated like an offering, now becomes an altar. She doesn't withhold love. She refines it. And when she gives it, it is not out of fear, but fullness. Not to be needed, but to share. She can say no without guilt. She can say yes without fear. Her choices come from within, not from the echo of past wounds or the pressure of social noise. This is what it means to be sovereign, to love without losing yourself, to stay soft without being swallowed, to give without going empty. This kind of woman can no longer be manipulated, not because she is cold, but because she has clarity. And clarity is protection. Jung observed that when we bring the unconscious into the light, we stop repeating. This is the power of awareness. The cycle breaks not through force, but through refusal. Refusal to perform for love. Refusal to shrink to be kept. Refusal to trade authenticity for approval. In this stage, abstinence no longer feels like discipline. It becomes devotion, not to an ideal, not to perfection, but to truth. Her truth. She recognizes now that every no is a yes to something deeper. A yes to peace, a yes to purpose, a yes to waiting for what aligns rather than reaching for what's available. This is the fire others feel but cannot name. The woman who has chosen herself burns differently. She is not trying to impress. She is not trying to earn. She simply is whole, aware, alive, and her presence is its own standard. People will feel it. Some will be drawn in, Others will retreat. Both are gifts, because now she knows she cannot be everything to everyone, nor should she be. Her worth is not negotiable. Her energy is not on discount. Her body is not a test. Her heart is not a convenience. These are not defenses. They are boundaries, sacred ones. They allow her to remain open but not exposed, loving but not leaking, giving but not disappearing. And in that strength, she becomes steady, even when alone, even when misunderstood, even when tested. Because now she knows the truth. She can be with someone, but she no longer needs to be saved. She can love, but she no longer chases being loved back. She can be admired, but she no longer needs admiration to feel valid. The woman who has walked through silence and come out whole cannot be lured by noise again. She no longer fills her calendar to feel wanted. She no longer explains her path to make others comfortable. She no longer reaches for hands that do not reach back with the same depth. Her boundary is her standard, and her standard is simple. If it does not feel like respect, she does not welcome it. If it does not feel like presence, she does not open to it. If it does not feel like truth, she does not follow it. There is no anger in this, no bitterness, just peace. A peace that comes from living in alignment with her soul. Not occasionally, not when it's easy, but every day as a way of being. She has become the fire. And now, anything that enters her life must know how to sit with that fire without trying to dim it. Anyone who draws near must come not to consume, but to honor. Because the woman who has learned to keep herself warm does not accept cold love. She would rather walk alone than walk halfway. She would rather wait in silence than settle in noise. She would rather burn slow and true than spark fast and fade. This is what choice looks like after awakening. It is not rigid. It is not cruel. It is simply clear. The fire she chose is not to destroy, but to transform. And from this point forward, everything she touches must rise to meet her or fall away quietly. She no longer chases. She chooses. There comes a time when the search ends. Not because everything has been found, but because something far more valuable has been remembered. The woman who once felt lost in silence no longer fears its weight. She no longer waits for others to name her value or for the world to echo her worth. The stillness she once resisted has become her sanctuary. And what once felt like emptiness now feels like peace. Carl Jung taught that we are not here to become perfect, but whole. And wholeness is not born through constant movement, but through quiet integration, through the sacred work of gathering every forgotten part of the self and holding it with presence. This is what she has done. She has walked through withdrawal without running. She has met her shadow without shame. She has let the false fall away so the real could rise. And now, there is no urgency to be chosen, because she has already chosen herself. Her silence is no longer waiting. It is alignment. Her solitude is no longer exile. It is clarity. Her boundaries are not barriers. They are devotion to what is true, to what is whole, to what can only grow in fertile ground. And in this space, a new kind of love becomes possible. Not a love that fills a void, but one that honors the fullness already present. not a connection born from fear, but one shaped by freedom. Not romance as escape, but as recognition. She no longer hungers for attention. She holds presence. She no longer performs for love. She embodies it. And love that meets her now must arrive with the same depth or not at all. This is not pride, it is integrity. Because the woman who has walked through the fire of her own silence can no longer accept anything that asks her to shrink. She no longer enters rooms where she must dim to be welcome. She no longer says yes where her soul whispers no. And even when the world cannot understand her stillness, she does not flinch, because she is not here to be understood by everyone. She is here to live in harmony with herself. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy is to live someone else's life, to wear a mask so long that the soul forgets its own shape. But now, she remembers. She remembers the sound of her own voice when it is not pleasing, the rhythm of her body when it is not performing, the wisdom of her silence when it is not mistaken for lack. This remembrance is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is steady, like the tide returning to shore. She no longer seeks proof. She lives from knowing, and from that knowing comes a quiet kind of radiance, one that cannot be bought, chased, or faked. A radiance that does not beg to be seen, but simply exists, and those who are ready will feel it. This is the woman who no longer asks, "What am I missing?" She asks, "What am I cultivating?" She no longer wonders, "Why haven't they come?" She asks, "What am I becoming?" And with every choice, every pause, every no rooted in wisdom, she honors the voice within. The soul that once whispered in her exhaustion now speaks clearly. It no longer hides in her dreams. It sits beside her in the day. Because now she is listening. She is listening to her cycles, her longings, her limits. She is listening to the way her body says yes and the way it says no. She is listening to the grief that still visits sometimes and the hope that rises without explanation. She is not pretending to be above desire. She has simply learned to trust desire that aligns with her depth, and this discernment is everything. Because the woman who honors her soul no longer fears being alone. She fears only forgetting herself again. So she stays rooted. She stays open. But she stays sovereign. No longer available for the half-love she once accepted. No longer chasing those who never saw her. No longer shrinking her truth just to be welcomed into places not meant for her spirit. This is the final stage of her transformation, not perfection, not arrival, but presence. She moves now with a different kind of strength, one that doesn't need to be proven, one that doesn't rise from control, but from peace. And it is here, in this quiet, sacred knowing, that she becomes the woman she was always meant to be, whole, grounded, undeniably herself. Jung once said that the soul becomes visible only when we stop trying to fix what was never broken. That healing is not about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget. That remembrance is complete. And now, as she walks forward, she carries no bitterness, only wisdom. No armor, only boundaries. No shame, only depth. She no longer confuses silence with punishment. She sees it now for what it is: an altar, a guide, a mirror, a home. And when the body grows still again, as it sometimes will, she will know it is not the end. It is a beginning, a space where the soul speaks in symbols, in seasons, in the language of the sacred. So if you are listening now and something in you feels like it's disappearing, know that you are not fading. You are returning, returning to what is real, to what is yours, to what no one else can name but you. Let this silence hold you. Let it teach you. Let it show you that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is pause, not to wait, but to listen. Because when the soul finally speaks, it does not shout. It does not beg. It simply says, "Welcome back." If something in this reflection has stirred something in you, I invite you to share it in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, or how this silence has shaped your own journey. And if you'd like to walk this path with others who feel the same pull toward truth and wholeness, you're welcome here. Until next time, stay close to your breath, trust your depth, and honor the wisdom of your own quiet becoming.